If Martha would stop talking to Sean, I'd have quorum at the table. Do. Oh, here comes quorum. Quorum's on his way. Oh, hey, quorum, what's up? All right, thank you. So I'm going to start with Will McDonald. So he was, I mentioned him before we took a break, and Councillor Menard had a question regarding the procurement policies of the City of Ottawa and the climate lens aspect. So Will, would you be able to comment on that? Or Sean, did you want to ask your question again to Will?
I spoke to Will afterwards, talked to him about the direction. I'm okay, unless there's another comment back. But
do you want to share it with the public? Because I don't, maybe my okay is different than Sean's okay.
Sure, Mr. Chair, perhaps the councillor could repeat his question and I can provide a response.
Yeah, so the question, it wasn't a question, it was a direction to staff to take back around accelerating the climate lens used for procurement in the City of Ottawa.
And Mr. Chair, we're, procurement staff are happy to work with the various departments to develop procurement strategies to meet these objectives. The city has a sustainable procurement guideline right now, which is developed in order to prompt the departmental spec writers to consider the 4 factors of sustainability in their procurement decisions, and staff from procurement will work to incorporate that criteria into their procurement strategies.
Okay. Yeah, so are you saying that you're going to be working with the direction to increase our, I guess, review of procurement decisions and how it affects climate change in the City of Ottawa? Are you saying you can accept that, or are you saying we're already doing that now?
So, Mr. Chair, we have to work with the departments in that procurement is responsible for how the procurement process is actually administered. It's the department as the technical experts that are responsible for what it is that we purchase, and so we would work with them to make sure that that direction is incorporated into their specifications and ultimately procurement strategies.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Thank you. I know our next question from Councillor was from Councillor Fleury. He couldn't come back, but I know that it was with respect to other departments. So, Mr. Willis, I know that through the Energy Evolution and the Phase 2 and the report that you're coming back to, I know one of the things you're working on is interdepartmental, initiatives when it comes to climate change master plan. Could you just comment on how this plan can be worked through all the departments to make sure everyone's kind of pulling in the same direction?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. Yes, certainly. First of all, to develop this plan in the first place, we've had an interdepartmental working group, and at many points during the group, the general managers who have the most involved, such as Mr. Wiley and I, have met directly to discuss bigger issues of that nature. We also have, that's been brewing, is an energy group within Mr. McDonald's group. Actually, it's looking at how Ottawa actually procures its energy right now, and it's over time as a corporate group will have a bigger role in providing feedback in terms of the nature of what we're buying and its carbon emissions in time. But it's in its infant stages, and it's primarily looking right now at more effective purchasing for power. It's an ongoing effort. It's certainly every department's involved, and every department will have a role as we move forward. And several of my colleagues are at the table, as you notice, because we all view it that way.
All right, thank you very much. I know he might have, I think there was another question he had, but he said he might reserve that for when this comes to council in 2020. Councillor McKenney, you're next.
Oh, good, okay.
Welcome.
Where am I? Environment. Sorry.
We actually changed the name.
Yeah, I know you did. To one that I could never remember. Listen, I'm not going to take much time. A lot was asked that concerns me as well. But I did want to ensure that I thank staff and this committee and certainly the sponsors group that worked on this. We've just taken one of those big giant steps, I believe, that is going to move us to a place where we have the opportunity, if we have the political will here, and I believe that we really do, to make a difference. It's we're not the biggest city, maybe in the biggest country with the most people, but everybody has their part to play. And as I look back in the report and look at what other cities, similar-sized cities, are doing, I can see that you know, what we're going to do here is going to be bold, and it will make a difference. And you know, it also occurred to me today as we were talking. I know some of my colleagues have already brought up the issue around procurement, our waste management plan, and to ensure that you know, that when we're looking at how we do things at the city, and how we manage and how we build our policy, that we're putting that climate lens on it. And that's always been a frustration, because you leave here and you maybe go to a transit commission and you start talking about electric buses, and you're told, okay, well, you know, good for us, we're going to get 4, you know, in a pilot project. Well, it's just not enough anymore. We have to be able to leave here, we have to be able to leave this committee and go into any other committee and know that this same lens is going to apply wherever we are, whatever table we're sitting at in the city. So it's for that I thank you. I think that it's you know, it will make our jobs easier, certainly. I just wanted to say also around the building codes, you know, I sit on the board of Ottawa Community Housing, and we're redeveloping, the chair does as well, and we're redeveloping a neighborhood in Rochester, Rochester Heights, and it's going to be a net zero building. And, you know, it's the second multi-residential, and both of our net zero buildings today are community housing, if you will. One is Salis Ottawa, which built the first, and they house people, you know, with mental illness, and OCH, we house people on lower incomes, and it's good for 2 reasons. One is it's good for the environment. It's good that we're building new stock that won't have that imprint on the climate, but it's also good for the people that we're housing. It saves money, it saves them money. So I really am encouraged by what the general manager said, that we are talking to the province, we are appealing to them for stricter building codes, because in 50, 60 years from now, which we expect these buildings to last, net zero will probably be a bit passé. So we have to think about, you know, what we're doing today that's going to apply in 50, 60 years from now. So I guess maybe just one question, if I may. Is there anything that we're not doing? I'm putting this to staff. Is there anything that you see, that you've discussed, that you see others are doing, that we're not doing here because of funding? Is there, if you had a bit more money, is there something you could add on to the list, and what would it be?
Chair, I'm going to answer that question because it's really not fair for other staff to answer that, because in all fairness, every single day goes by and we have lots of great ideas, because that's just what we do. I think we have reflected very carefully in the last 3 years worth of work of where the biggest bang for our buck is, and the advice we're giving to council is focused on our biggest bang for our buck. That doesn't mean that there aren't other ideas that are going to come up, and Councillor Menard made some points about continuing community engagement, and I think we intend to, because there may be better ideas that do pop up over time, and I'd like to believe that we could actually integrate them in. There will be other programs from other governments, there will be other technological changes that present us new opportunities that don't exist today. But in all fairness, we have given you recommendations of where we think you're going to have the highest impact for investment.
Thank you very much. So almost exactly an hour after he thought he was going to ask his question, Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But feeling in better spirits now that I have food in me.
And song.
Yes, yes. Does staff have a list of all the projects that they would like to see? You say that this committee sees the projects that we can advance as soon as possible, that are affordable. You probably have a longer list. It may get shot down when you have your more senior budget discussions that don't see the light of day for us. can we see a fulsome list of projects that we'd like, knowing that we have limited funds? But I think this committee needs to see any and all possible projects. Is that list available?
So Chair, as part of the next report, which is coming in Q2, where we take the 20 different action areas, we will give you specific references to specific projects, and we will indicate the degree of affordability of each of those projects. Some of them are easy ones we can move ahead with, some of which we will not have a strategy for financing because it's a longer-term investment. But all that information will be provided to you, and it will be available for a fulsome discussion when we're back.
Great. This committee needs to know just that, what options are before us, and we can't limit ourselves to the cost. We need to have that discussion and debate here because the cost of doing nothing is far greater. Have we done a high-end analysis on what the cost would be to the city, to our taxpayers, to business owners if we do nothing?
Thank you for the question. As referenced earlier, we don't have Ottawa-specific data for that, but through the local climate projections analysis that we're doing now and the vulnerability assessment and subsequent climate resiliency strategy, we may have a better sense.
We're not here to arm wrestle what the causes of climate change are. There's a very strong agreement among folks in the academic world that it is real. There's certainly no doubt from myself, but climate is changing. And we have to react to that. And when you look at what the cost of one Constance Bay flooding is to the homeowners, the psychological trauma, the Army, our resources, all the projects that get delayed within the Ottawa because we have staff out there, whatever that price tag is, the cost of one tornado, September tornado, and on and on and on. We have a record number of, just last week, Friday, legal department released pothole, car and injury, personal injury damage, probably a record number that we saw in 2018. Record freeze and thaw cycles, all weather related. Regardless of what the cause is, the reality is this is happening. And so the cost of doing nothing is far greater than any investment we can make as a city. And we should be doing more, but I just want to say the cost of doing nothing is far, far greater. I think the two major factors that we have to wrestle with are budget, the cost of implementing a very strong list of ideas that the general manager just talked about, and something I think we need to do more of as a council, and that is leverage our provincial and federal governments. If we want substantial change on the housing or homelessness file, the federal government and provincial government need to work with municipalities. We can't do it on our own. And I can list many other examples. And the other is climate change and just our whole battle plan, where do we actually think 445 municipalities in this province should be reinventing the wheel, doing all their work like this, when we should have the feds in the province announcing some pretty significant benchmarks, legislation, but also goals that we all need to work towards. And then each level has their responsibilities to get us there. So leveraging AMO and the FCM, but also the leaders on council working with our leaders at the provincial and federal governments on some low-hanging fruit and some other more challenging objectives for their help, financial, but also to have, as I said, the provincial and federal governments to make certain statements or goals or objectives. Lots of good suggestions about, amending building codes, renovation credits. A woman at the beginning said the mandatory GHG analysis for projects. I really like that one. The whole talk about the green economy and really is a net benefit for jobs in this country. Of course, transit, we don't have to repeat that, all the benefits of transit. But again, building codes, a lot of these the city does not have the authority over. But again, we need to emphasize and re-emphasize with the other levels of government the importance of these particular initiatives. Just a few questions that had come in prior to today. One was regarding GHG emission data for solid waste. In the report, the staff report talked about data between 2017 and 2018, a drop from 46.8 kilotons of CO2 to 21.2. Is that correct data? Can you just comment on that?
Chair, to clarify, are you talking about on the corporate emission side or on the community emission side?
This is, well, solid waste. I would assume this is at our Trail Road facility, landfill facility.
Sure, there's a significant difference between community versus corporate, because corporate deals with Trail Road. When we talk about community, there are other private landfills within the city, and their performance is quite different from ours.
All right, I'll look that one up and get back to you. With respect to Trail Road, though, again, starting in 2021, we're seeing an increase that's anticipated. Can you talk about that further? What's driving that particular increase?
Chair, there is an anticipated increase given our current operations at the landfill. We will be reviewing that through the master plan, and we'll be looking at ways to decrease that greenhouse gas emission.
But you are confirming we are expecting to see a rise in GHGs as of 2021?
Chair, I would say the verdict's out. Like I said, given our current operations and the way we're operating under our current C of A, it requires recirculation of leachate, which does cause GHGs. We're reviewing that, and I think staff's aim will be to not increase, actually to continue to decrease.
Very good. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Brockington. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all your hard work. I'm pleased to be a member of the Climate Change Sponsorship Group. It's an honor to hear all that's going on and all the work that you're doing. I really appreciate it. I'm sort of doing big picture stuff here, but there's internal goals, stuff that we can do as a city in terms of changing regulations. There's and making actions ourselves, but there's also a lot of external goals in terms of getting people to change their habits, and that is where the education part comes in. And you know, I'm a little concerned because it's a mammoth goal, and where you're basically just hiring a person, and that's a lot on their shoulders. My concern is in terms of the involvement with public health is something they're very good at. Unfortunately, public health has been is getting a bit of a squeeze right now, and they don't have as much funding as they used to, and their future is not certain. So I am concerned about that, and I see it's listed as one of the partners, of course, because that's really important moving forward, because this is a big part of why we're doing this in the first place, is public health. I just wanted to talk about that and the role of public health in this, because I see it as crucial. I have concerns, and I hope the provincial government is listening to how important this is.
On the first point related to the education and outreach piece, certainly what our goal will be is to amplify the messages that we have. So first, alignment with organizations, many of whom spoke today and have robust networks themselves. Although we may only be hiring one person, our goal would be to leverage the networks and communication channels which exist in other places of the city, and where we have ambassadors or champions that could amplify those messages. Ottawa Public Health is a perfect example of one of the departments which is supporting us in doing that. We're blessed to have not only one but two part-time seconded staff from Ottawa Public Health who are contributing both to the development of the Climate Change Master Plan and the 8 priorities, as well as to the development of the new official plan. So we're blessed to have their involvement, and I guess I'll just turn and see if anyone from Public Health wanted to add anything to that.
They were here earlier, and I've had the pleasure of working with them. They even took a bike tour of my ward with me, so I know they're very dedicated. Which kind of leads me to my next question, is in terms of ward initiatives and plans that we can do with the community, something that they can see themselves in front of them. Has there been any thought to that idea? Because I saw some of the initiatives that have gone, and you put down which ward they're in. There's nothing yet in Bay Ward, but I would love to see stuff and have some analysis of where we can work with the community on moving forward on initiatives that they can see right in their community. Is that possible to do? Maybe have a climate change meeting with them?
Certainly, as we're developing each of the 20 projects, there will be an assessment of readiness, and there will be an equity and inclusion lens applied to that. Because, of course, across the city, we have varying wards and degrees of ability to implement these types of solutions. So although we haven't identified anything at a ward-specific level, we've had questions from councillors or requests from councillors to provide information, answer questions they receive, and we have partners who are coming forward in a range of wards, either representing cross-community organizations or ward-specific initiatives that they may be interested. So it's something we can consider as the 20 projects are being more fully developed.
I know that Ecology Ottawa has already done door-to-door work in my ward on this idea, but I think we need a city involvement to push that forward even more. They did a lot of excellent work, and I want to thank them for it. But I think that it would help if the city was doing that work as well and helping us in our wards so that we can reach out to people and give them ideas. One of the suggestions I have is, with New Year's coming up, is everybody have a climate change resolution and maybe do some small initiatives of their own that they can promise to do. But in the meantime, I'd like to see something at the ward level so that we can take the message to them of how they can change, because clearly that's the biggest part of what we have to do is education, and that would be a good way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for staff on the Climate Change Master Plan? Seeing none, just want to thank, before I read the report recommendations, which is going to take me like 20 minutes, I just want to thank staff, of course, Steve Willis for your leadership, Jen Brown, Andrew Flowers, Mike Fletcher, Don Herwire for being here. You're right there. Good to see you. Just for the work you've done over the years. I know you have more than just yourselves that are involved in this, and I know the councillors that join, Councillor Menard and I on the sponsors group, I think it's important to have councillors involved in the steps of these reports as they come forward. Obviously, it makes it a lot smoother when we get to this point. But Councillor Cavanaugh mentioned that she's on that sponsors group with us, and Councillor Sudds, Councillor Dudas, and Councillor Fleury are also on that with us. So much appreciated. So I'm just going to read the all the recommendations, just so that those listening at home can follow along. So that Standing Committee on Environment Protection, Water and Waste Management recommend that Council, 1, receive the 2017-2018 greenhouse gas inventories attached to document 3 and as outlined in this report. 2, approve A, new 2025, 2030, and 2040 corporate targets to reduce GHG emissions 100% by 2040 below 2012 levels. B, new 2025, 2030, 2040, and 2050 community targets to reduce GHG emissions 100% by 2050 below 2012 levels. 3, approve the Climate Change Master Plan attached as document 4 and as outlined in this report. 4, receive a project status update on energy evolution, including the draft energy and emissions model and a draft list of proposed projects to be more fully developed as part of the energy evolution final report attached as documents 5, 6, and 7 and as outlined in this report. 5, direct staff to bring forward the final energy evolution Ottawa's community energy transition strategy in Q2 2020 that includes A, finalized energy evolution and energy and emissions model, B, a financial and affordability analysis of the model to identify the investment required, the net present value, the return on investment, marginal abatement costs, and employment impacts, C, detailed descriptions of the proposed energy evolution projects listed in this report, including roles and responsibilities, timelines, municipal authorities, and barriers to implementation, equity and inclusion considerations, and resourcing needs. D, a proposed spending plan for the 2019 Hydro Ottawa dividend surplus once the value of the dividend surplus is known. 6, delegate authority to the Council Sponsors Group on Climate Change to provide the Mayor with a list of priority areas and activities which are consistent with the Council-approved Climate Change Master Plan to allow the Mayor to advocate with the federal and provincial governments on program funding, co-delivery opportunities, and related policy and regulatory supports necessary to implement the Climate Change Master Plan priority projects as appropriate. And 7, approve the spending plan in document 13 and summarized in this report for the $210,000 of unspent 2017 and 2018 Hydro Ottawa dividend surplus funds. Is that item carried? Carried. Carried. Thank you. And now we move on to item 2. Thank you all. So item 2 is the tree bylaw review project. So we will start with a presentation from staff. So I believe Martha Copestake is going to do this presentation, if I'm not mistaken. I see you brought some charcuterie boards.
The red blacks, the red black things. That's what they are.
Thanks so much. My name is Martha Copestake. I'm a forester in the Natural Systems and Rural Affairs Group of PIDE, and I'm here today to present the staff recommendations stemming from the Tree Bylaw Review Project. So this is a joint project between PIDE and Public Works. I've been working closely with the forestry staff and Public Works on the proposed solutions that I'm presenting today. And we think we've developed a sound solution to a challenging, kind of surprisingly challenging problem. The new tree protection bylaw proposed today, along with the proposed changes to the implementation processes, will bring Ottawa's approach to tree protection in line with other major municipalities in Ontario. The project was based on consultation with both internal and external stakeholder groups, and we're able to come forward today with this fulsome solution because of the detailed feedback that we've gotten from very dedicated stakeholders representing urban communities, environmental groups, and the development community. So I'll start with a little bit of background. The Ontario Municipal Act gives the city the ability to enact tree bylaws. The City of Ottawa currently has 2 tree bylaws in place: the Municipal Trees and Natural Areas Protection Bylaw, which was enacted in 2006, and it requires permission to remove any tree on city property citywide. We've also got the Urban Tree Conservation Bylaw, which was enacted in 2009, and it covers trees on private property within the urban area of Ottawa. It's applied based on property size, and on private properties greater than 1 hectare in size, a permit's required to remove any tree 10 centimeters in diameter or larger, so smaller than both of those. For smaller properties, so 1 hectare or less in size, a permit's required to remove trees 50 centimeters or more in diameter, and these are what we call distinctive trees, and that's the big tree cookie that we have over there. So neither of these bylaws have had a fulsome review since their inception. The Urban Tree Conservation Bylaw particularly was designed to address the issues of the day when it was developed, and given the steady pace of infill development and infrastructure in the last 10 years, those issues have changed. I'm just going to take this sweater off because I'm very hot all of a sudden. Okay. A review of the city's tree bylaws was a key recommendation of the council-approved Urban Forest Management Plan, and staff have been observing problems and our stakeholders are seeing clearly many ways in which the Urban Tree Conservation Bylaw has not been meeting the objectives that it set out to meet. In addition to improving the effectiveness of the existing bylaws, the project had a specific focus on redesigning the processes to implement the tree bylaws. A strong and effective tree bylaw will help to ensure that the city continues to meet the goals identified in the UFMP. So today, the value of trees is well understood. However, it must be better recognized. There needs to be a broader understanding around the impacts of the "it's just one tree" style of decision-making. The cumulative impact of single tree loss over time has now become apparent. Last year, staff conducted a study in partnership with Carleton University to measure tree loss between 2008, which is the year before the Urban Tree Conservation Bylaw came into effect, and 2017, in several inner urban neighborhoods where we had been observing a high level of infill development and tree loss. So over the 9-year period, between 30 to 58% of the trees that were sampled in 2008 were lost and not replaced in 2017. And in both Wellington Village and Westboro, this was confirmed to be a loss of just over 40% of the canopy cover. These results indicate a high level of tree loss despite the enactment of the Urban Tree Conservation Bylaw. This sustained tree loss and lack of replacement are not considered with the official plan objectives or the visions and principles of the Urban Forest Management Plan. Through the approval of the UFMP, the Council has recognized the central role that the urban forest plays in public health, urban design, and climate resiliency. Resiliency is one of the 5 big moves for the new official plan, which have now been Council approved. The retention and protection of existing trees is a core means of building climate resiliency to adapt to future climate conditions. So in the context of a climate emergency, trees play a vital role in the urban area by mitigating urban heat island effects, helping to manage stormwater runoff, among other things. And of course, tree bylaws are the key regulatory tool that enable the city to protect trees. So a shift in thinking, or what I've been calling a culture change, is actually fundamental to the success of the proposed approach. So even just through doing this project, staff have seen a marked difference in attitudes about trees, which is encouraging. There are resource implications to address the issues that have been identified, and given the resource requirements, we've proposed a phased approach. So I'm going to go through that. Staff recommend that the first phase be approved now for implementation in May 2020. The first phase includes several important changes to the tree bylaw, which I'll go over in just a second, and it keeps the distinctive tree diameter at 50 centimeters. Phase 1 requires 3 new full-time positions for implementation. So one of these positions has been found through temporary internal vacancies, and the other 2 positions we will be able to offset those other 2 positions by the increased revenue from the new application fees that we're proposing today. So there will be a net zero impact on the 2020 budget for those 3 positions. One of the recommendations of the staff report is to create these 2 new positions. So staff proposed to report back in September with phase 2 recommendations. And that's where we'll include a decrease of the distinctive tree diameter from 50 centimeters to 30 centimeters. This decrease will require more resources. The smaller the tree, the more trees there are, so this change will result in more calls and more permit requests. Phase 2 would be implemented in 2021, and it requires up to 5 additional new positions, as well as making the phase 1 temporary position permanent, so it's 6 in total. So these resource requirements for phase 2 would need to be included as a budget pressure for 2021, and staff will be working with finance on cost recovery options to reduce that budget pressure, and we'll report back on this in September. So let's get into the phase 1 bylaw changes. So for phase 1, we've developed a new harmonized tree protection bylaw. It brings the 2 existing bylaws into one for a more consistent and streamlined bylaw. Fundamentally, the new bylaw will function the same way in that it has specific parts related to municipal trees, municipal natural areas, private distinctive trees, and trees on private property greater than 1 hectare. But we've got a lot more that we'll be doing in terms of implementation, which I'll get into. The new tree protection bylaw is to come into effect on May 1st, 2020. The new tree bylaw has improved tree protection requirements. So in the current bylaws, it was clear that protecting trees was required, but they were short on details of exactly what that meant. So this new bylaw has a full part dedicated to how trees must be protected. This clearly lays out the requirements for everyone, but it also means that failure to protect a tree adequately would be a clearer violation of the new bylaw. The compensation requirements for city-owned trees, for the removal of city-owned trees, have been formalized in the new tree bylaw, and new compensation requirements for the removal of private trees have been added. Tree compensation would be required when a permit is issued for a tree to be removed to compensate for the lost value of that tree. For city trees, a widely used tree valuation formula will continue to be used to calculate the compensation value. And for the removal of distinctive trees, and this is new, we haven't required compensation before, a ratio for replacement trees will be used. So that ratio is proposed to be different for the removal of trees in an infill development scenario versus in a non-development scenario. So for infill development, when a distinctive tree is removed, it's proposed that 3 trees must be planted in its place. And if the 3 trees can't be planted on the site, a monetary value would be accepted in place. And that would go into the city's tree planting accounts. And for non-development scenarios, the replacement ratio would be 1-to-1, so 1 tree planted for tree removed. Staff is also proposing to introduce new application fees for cost recovery. In the current bylaws, the only fee is to remove a distinctive tree. It's $100. It's been in place for about the last 4 or 5 years, and it's often charged on a site basis rather than on a per tree basis. So this slide shows what the new application fees for the removal would be for the removal of municipal trees specifically. So again, the application fee will depend if it's an infill development scenario or not. And if it's unrelated to infill development, a homeowner needs to remove a tree in the right-of-way in front of their house for maybe servicing work, fixing their driveway, something like that. It would be $150 per tree up to a max of $750. And of course, in that kind of work with a municipal tree, we wouldn't imagine that there would be more than one tree to remove. In an infill development scenario, it would be $500 per tree. So this reflects the increasingly complex nature of the infill development files and the associated staff time required for review and oversight of those files. And this slide here shows a similar table, but for private urban trees. So the cost structure is similar to the municipal tree fees. If the removal of a distinctive tree is for infill development, the application fee is proposed to be $500 per tree. If the removal is being done for some reason by an average resident, so a non-development scenario, the application fee is proposed to also be $150 per tree, up to a maximum of $750. Any removals that are done as a result of a Planning Act application, so for a site plan or plan of subdivision, the application fee will be included in the required development fees. And it's important to note that if a tree is dead, or if it's an immediate threat to public health and safety, or if it's an ash tree, a permit is not required, and therefore there's no application fee. So this new application fee structure is in line with other Ontario municipalities, and it represents a fiscally responsible approach to implementing this tree protection program. So two more important bylaw changes. In the Mayor's State of the City address at the start of this year, he put a clear lens on the need for stronger tree bylaws in Ottawa in recognition of the fact that trees are clearly a priority for all members of council. He talked about increasing fines and eliminating those oops moments that may have happened that result in trees coming down. So in response, we've been able to introduce a new special fine into the enforcement section of the new bylaw. The special fine can be charged in addition to regular fines, and it's intended to eliminate or reduce any economic or financial gain from contravening the bylaw. The regular fines can range from $500 to $100,000, and the special fines are not limited to $100,000. And finally, we've made improvements to the submission requirements to obtain distinctive tree permits. The requirements are more clear now and should result in better reports being submitted overall and a better understanding of how to protect trees. So now I'm going to go through some of the important process changes that we're making in phase one to address the issues that we've been seeing. And as I've said, we feel probably the most important part is to fix some of the problems that we've been seeing. So first, we'll work to ensure that trees are considered much earlier in the development process. So this applies to both private developments and city infrastructure projects. We're going to make a change that requires that tree information is submitted with Committee of Adjustment applications so that the committee can take trees into account in their decision-making. The one new staff position that we'll have in PIDE for phase one will be what we're calling an infill forester. This person will be responsible for the review of all those Committee of Adjustment application files for building permit applications for infill development and making comments on tree retention and protection for those sites. So we're going to have that direct line or contact in the planning department to go through those applications, working with the forestry inspectors and forestry who are on the ground. We're going to improve access to tree protection information so that it's more clear. And as a part of the development of the new official plan, staff is working to develop stronger policies around trees. So the policy directions for the new OP have been approved by council, as I mentioned, and the specific policy directions around urban trees will guide the new policies that we'll be developing. Staff will use the winter to reach out to all interest groups on the new bylaw and develop web materials. A broad education and training campaign will be rolled out before the new bylaw comes into effect in May. Staff have already begun work on what a robust monitoring program will look like for the new tree protection bylaw. So the intention is to have the monitoring and protection program in place before the new bylaw takes effect in May as well. And one of the most important process items is to develop clear rules around tree permitting. So I'm going to switch to this diagram. Those who have seen my old diagram can see that this new diagram is much better looking. So this diagram shows a building lot, and we plan to use something like this as kind of a starting point for when we will or will not issue tree permits. So I have to make an important disclaimer for something like this, because since trees are living, these kind of decisions really are on a case-by-case basis. So it's always going to depend on the condition of the tree, as well as the species, the size, the location, but also the site conditions as well. So there's lots of aspects coming into this. But we think that having something like this can really be a transparent starting point to show that the city is getting tough about tree removals and show the kind of expectations that, that we have around tree protection. So I'll just go over the diagram really quickly. I'm going to use this laser pointer. Does it work? No. Oh, what? Oh, it doesn't have enough, okay, that doesn't matter. So at the bottom, at the bottom you can see where the street is and the sidewalk, and you can see there's a tree right there in the right-of-way. Then you see the site, and you can see the as-of-right building envelope. For those trees that are within the as-of-right building envelope, it's okay. For the trees that are in the as-of-right building envelope, that's where we're seeing, the city has decided that that's where the building can be. So that's where we see the place where we're going to issue tree permits. If that's where the tree is located, that's a reasonable place to say, we've already decided development can happen there, and that's where we would issue a tree permit. If you look back to the right-of-way and you see that city tree in the right-of-way, that's a city-owned tree. The city's been paying for the maintenance of that tree, and it provides a really important benefit to the whole community because it's right on the street there. That's a place where we're going to be getting tougher and saying, no, you need to work to protect that tree. I know that people would say that there's difficulties in doing that kind of thing, but that's where we're going to be looking for changes in terms of how we do development. And protecting that tree adequately. Similar with the tree sort of at the back top right there, which is, you know, in the required amenity space in the backyard. That's another place where we're going to be looking for those trees to be protected back there. It is also providing a benefit to multiple homeowners. It easily could be providing a benefit to, you know, 3 or 4 properties behind that house as well as the property that it's on. And so we're looking for those trees to be protected. The ones that you see sort of hugging, the to be determined ones hugging up against the building envelope, those are sort of more difficult because we know that when somebody's building, there's where the foundation will be, there has to be an excavation limit that's further out, usually around 3 feet. And so we just have to determine what the size of those trees are, what the condition of those trees are, and how they could possibly be built around. So those are the to be determines. So the idea is that this diagram would be online, available for all to see. We'll use it in our education materials as we go out through the winter. And then staff and applicants would take site-specific situations and work to implement the intent of this as appropriate. Okay, so now on to phase 2. As I said, staff proposed to report back to this committee in September with revisions to the tree protection bylaw to reflect the rest of the proposed solution. So this will include reducing the diameter of distinctive trees to 30 centimeters. The current 50 centimeters is large. Most private land tree bylaws in Ontario apply to a smaller tree size. Part of the objective of the project was to maintain and increase the diversity of the urban forest over time. And an important part of that is to maintain an uneven age or size structure in our urban forest. And that means that there needs to be a focus on not just protecting very large size trees, but also on protecting smaller trees. And so this is one of the reasons that we brought these tree cookies here, is that you can see the smaller one closer to me is what a 30 centimeter tree is. And the one beyond is what a 50 centimeter tree looks like. So it just gives you a sense of what kind of sizes we're looking at, and certainly gives you a sense that protecting a 30 centimeter tree means that we're looking at protecting potentially a lot more trees. So the second change in phase 2 would be to introduce a permit to work around trees for infill developments. So this would enable city staff to have more oversight on all infill sites, so whether a tree permit is requested or not, to ensure that adequate tree protection measures are in place and we aren't inadvertently losing trees to construction damage. Things like you can see in this picture here. So both of these changes proposed for phase 2 are proposed to be implemented only for the inner urban area. So that's the urban area within the green belt, because we see that as the place where we're having the biggest challenges, obviously. So as I mentioned earlier, up to 5 additional positions are required to implement phase 2, and we're going to be working with finance on cost recovery options. And pending the required resources being funded for 2021, staff will report back in September with these revisions to the tree protection bylaw. So it's important to note that phase 2 cannot be implemented within existing resources, so those new resources will be fundamental to the success of phase 2. When staff reports back in September, The intention is to also propose a heritage tree strategy at that time and an approach to protecting peri-urban woodlands. So we've not yet tackled these two important elements. They are part of this project. We've been putting a strong focus on fixing what we've got. We've identified these major issues with what we've got in place, and we want to fix what we've got before we start adding new elements. But we will be looking at those two important elements as a part of phase 2. So to summarize, a shift in thinking is required to support the implementation of the new bylaw. The proposed tree protection bylaw and the process changes to implement it will be key to protecting Ottawa's urban canopy. The proposed approach is phased to ensure that adequate resources are secured for implementation. Without adequate resources, the diameter decrease for phase 2 cannot be realized. Trees are key to building Ottawa's climate resiliency. The value of trees must be better recognized as Ottawa continues to grow. And as I wrap up, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues from forestry, planning, legal, bylaw, and beyond who have been so key to the development of this approach. And I'd also like to thank all the stakeholders who have been so committed to this project through really starting with the development of the Urban Forest Management Plan and ongoing until now. And I'd like to recognize their important contribution to this work. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there not more to the presentation?
What's that?
There's more slides.
Oh, well, those were just like in case there were questions.
Okay, thanks. I was anticipating more. I was like, wait, are we done?
No, I'm done.
Because I'm like looking ahead. I'm like, there's a lot more stuff here. Okay. So we're going to go, first of all, there's just, I know that you mentioned the collaboration, the working together with certain groups. Through that, from what I understand, there's a motion that was crafted as just a further refinement to the plan to better align the two different groups being represented. So I just wanted to ask Councillor Cloutier to put that motion forward on the table so that we have it, and then maybe get staff to respond to it briefly just before we go to delegations.
Thank you, Chair. Whereas the report, as stated, proposes a new tree protection bylaw to support the protection and enhancement of the city's urban tree canopy, and whereas the proposed bylaw includes a permit fee on a per-tree basis for the removal of distinctive trees, and whereas the permit fee for removing a tree that is not associated with infill development is $150 per tree, up to a maximum of 750 or 5 trees, and whereas the permit fee for removing a tree that is associated with infill development is $500, but with no maximum indicated, and whereas staff recommend implementing a maximum permit fee for infill development for consistency, therefore be it resolved that the Standing Committee on Environmental Protection, Water and Waste Management recommend to Council that the bylaw to be amended to set the maximum permit fee for infill developments at $2,500 or 5 trees to correspond with the limit set for non-infill tree removals.
So can I just ask, just understanding why this wasn't necessarily incorporated into the report, but it's here today as a motion?
When we did our consultations with our stakeholders, we indicated that we would be increasing tree permit or application fees. We didn't have the fee structure in place when we did our consultations. And in speaking with the developer group, of which of course this infill development component implicates, last week, we had discussion around the fact that these are higher fees for their work, and that we were focused on a cost recovery approach for this. And if you look at it from the perspective of, how much more time does it take us to review more trees in that, it was sort of pointed out that the maximum could be, applicable for the development scenario as well.
All right, and just the further steps. So this is just the permit fee. What would the other process be? So you're asking for, if someone comes forward with a permit for 5 trees, it's $2,500. What else is involved in that?
Well, there's still going to be compensation. The compensation still stands, and there's no sort of maximum on the compensation. It's still on a per tree basis. So for on a private property, for the infill development scenario, compensation is 3-to-1, and that requirement would apply for each tree. So each tree that has to be removed has to be compensated 3-to-1.
Okay.
Or paid for.
Right. All right, thank you. So I want to go just with that, just go straight to delegations. So I'm going to start with Mr. Brian Bevan, who is the co-chair of the Trees and Green Space Committee of the Centertown Community Association, and then followed by Rob Barnes of College Ottawa.
Chairman Moffat, councillors, my name is Brian Bevan, and as Chairman Moffat just said, I'm the chair of the Trees and Green Space Committee of the Centertown Community Association. Throughout the bylaw review, the Centertown Community Association has taken part in the process organized by CAFES, the Community Association's Forum for Environmental Sustainability. We fully endorse the consensus of 22 community associations that participated in CAFE's process over the past 2 years. We endorse also the reservations that CAFE's spokesperson are presenting later today. However, Centertown has its own unique situation. Centertown is on the leading edge of modern urban land development of the Centre Core. We know that this intense development is eroding the urban tree canopy to a tipping point where, under our watch, large parts of it may be irretrievably lost. The staff report provides the unequivocal statistics. We endorse, in general, the draft tree protection bylaw presented by staff. However, we wish to raise 4 limited and specific concerns. The first concern relates to bullet 2 on page 18 of the report, in the section entitled Develop Clear Rules Around Tree Permitting. The report says, and I quote in summary, quote, specific rules for intensification versus infill developments. There could be a more flexibility on tree removals for developments that are creating more units, end quote. This wording suggests that intensification, meaning replacement of residences with multiple unit residential structures on small city lots, should receive reduced requirements to retain, replace, and renew the tree canopy. Since almost all infill projects involve an increase in units on site, this attempt to allow flexibility is a fatal flaw. It is a continuation of the status quo. The truth is that this formulation of the issue will guarantee that the urban tree canopy will continue to deteriorate in Centertown and the communities bordering Centertown. The solution is simple. Some sort of design with trees approach should apply irrespective of the kind of infill involved. Either delete the offending bullet 2 on page 18, or adjust it to explain that development will require an effort to design with trees irrespective of whether the infill involves intensification or not. Second, in Schedule B, outlining tree compensation, there is a formula whereby a developer must provide money compensation when he or she will not be replacing trees on site. Inadvertently, I think, this schedule sets a ridiculously low figure of less than $2,000 on the intrinsic value of a mature tree 50 centimeters or more in diameter. This sets up an economic calculation that will work against the mature distinctive trees in the downtown core and almost guarantee their continued willy-nilly destruction. The solution is to make the value of mature, distinctive trees non-trivial. Make the value of a tree that is removed $10,000. This intrinsic value, the intrinsic value of a live 50-centimeter tree in situ is priceless in the sense that, once gone, its equivalence will not be achieved before all of us here today are dead. Not just me. All you youngsters too. We need more realistic figures than those currently in Schedule B. Third, the report proposes, the report proposes
that the reduction in the diameter of mature trees subject to protection from 50 centimeters to 30 centimeters will wait until Phase 2 in 2021. This leaves a huge portion of the downtown urban forest vulnerable and unprotected in the meantime. The trees in this category, over 30, under 50 centimeters, are the future mature, distinct trees of the next 30 years. We are creating a huge temptation here for developers to take down mature trees before the rules change. Let's protect the trees we want to protect now. Declare the 30-centimeter formulation in force immediately on an interim trial basis for the next 2 years. Then, over those 2 years, evaluate the effects. That way, the Phase 2 formulations can be based on the actual experiment that will provide concrete data.
Sir, can you wrap up, please, sir?
Yes. Finally, we are concerned about the postponement of a designation process to protect heritage trees until some unspecified third phase. This means that even the most valuable and important trees in the downtown remain vulnerable, not for 2 years, but for an indeterminate period. Why leave these most important trees vulnerable indefinitely? We urge you to conserve and protect heritage trees as part of Phase 2.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McKenney has a question for you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out, Brian. It's nice to see you. Back in 1998, I went to work for Councillor Holmes. I'm going to tell you just a really quick, kind of funny story. I arrived in the office. I knew little. Actually, I knew nothing. I always wondered why she had hired me. But she did. And everything was an acronym, and I didn't understand any of the acronyms. And I remember one day I had this file folder, and it said, in big capital bold letters, TREE committee. And I said, what's a TREE? And she said, well, it's a little bigger than a bush. She didn't have a lot of patience for me either at the time. She said, well, Catherine, it's a little bigger than a bush. It's called a tree. So back in the point of my comment is not to show how much I've advanced, but that in 1998, we actually had a tree committee, similar to what you have today, the Trees and Green Space. Back in 1998, we knew in the downtown that we were losing trees at an alarming rate. And you can imagine the difference between 1998 and today. If only we could go back.
I see it every day.
I know, I do too. I almost don't like looking at old pictures. And I remember another time seeing a picture, again, it was in Councillor Holmes's, I'm sure it was in that folder, of King Edward. And it was an old picture of King Edward up against a more recent one. And you know what I realized? You could not tell in the more recent one that it was winter, because there were no trees. You couldn't tell what season it was on King Edward because there were no trees on King Edward. It used to be this beautiful leafy boulevard. And that's where we've come to. So I think it's important. I'm going to be asking questions that you've raised to staff, but I think it is really important. It's important to remember that, downtown, infill, there are, we have the least number of trees in our ward, but we are not being alarmist. To lose another 50% of our trees in the next few years would be beyond devastating. It would mean that we would not meet any of our climate resiliency targets. And we would have an unlivable downtown. So I thank you for coming out. I thank you for continuing the work of the Old Tree Committee, which is now the Trees and Green Space Committee. And I look forward to continuing working with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further questions for the delegation? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Bevan. Appreciate it. Thanks. Rob Barnes, followed by Daniel Buckles of the Community Associations for Environmental Sustainability.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm Rob Barnes, back again, round 2 now about trees. I just wanted to start by, providing some of the context that this is already in the documents presented, but just the scope and scale of transformation, and I think Councillor McKenney touched on that too. I mean, Ecology Ottawa has been working on the trees issue for many years now, in part because we were approached by community leaders. I see Daniel Buckles is here today, many others, talking about the loss, especially in urban neighborhoods. And of course, there was that little study that was included as part of this document showing a 30 to 55% that many trees sampled in 2008 were lost and not replaced over the course of a decade. So obviously this is important to many of us, and we know that trees are a key part of climate resiliency. So what do we like about what we're seeing here in terms of the tree protection bylaw? There's earlier consideration of trees in development process. We've heard this has been a concern for a long time. Requirement of a permit to work around trees, special rules for infill developments that don't create new units. And of course, protections. The distinctive tree sizes being lowered. That's great. I think that's something the community has been asking for a while now. Other positive elements with the bylaw today is just the higher fees in general and the new special fine, of course, to eliminate financial gain from contravention of the bylaw. So a lot of really important elements here. But we know that it'll take resources, right? This is the perennial challenge, is to make sure that we're staffing at a level that is able to implement some of these changes. And so, draw the attention of the committee to the fact that three FTEs and then 5 FTEs will be needed to implement the 2 phases of this project. And it's something that we hope that council will move forward on, and that we will be watching to make sure that there's that emphasis placed on resources so that we can actually follow through on some of the good ideas here in this plan. In terms of challenges, I mean, we're reflecting, I think, what some of the community voices are saying here. Obviously, the phased approach does mean delays to distinctive tree protection. And so there was an idea offered, I saw from Paul Johannes of Green Space Alliance, maybe something like a moratorium on tree cutting. I don't know what powers we have as a committee or council to move forward on some of these early protections, but we know that with these bylaws coming down the pipe, that you might see a lot of early motions to get rid of a lot of trees sooner rather than later. And so we urge the committee to consider its options in terms of protecting trees that might be at risk with the passage of this new bylaw. And obviously, I think as Brian mentioned, there's urgency to creating heritage tree bylaw and peri-urban woodlands tree bylaw, and of course resources to move these along. Other challenges, I know the community was asking for even stronger protections in terms of reducing the diameter breast height to 20 centimeters. I know we got it down to 30, but I think the community is asking for even more protections in the future. And of course, there is the risk of arbitrariness and unpredictability. I think the bylaw adds a lot of clarity, but there's still a lot of discretion. And I think some of it is inevitable. I think, as Martha said, dealing with living things like trees, all of this is negotiated on a case-by-case basis. But of course, the more clarity and the more protection, the better. And of course, monitoring and enforcement will remain a challenge. Again, it's down to resources. Maybe there are missed opportunities here, or opportunities to tie things into the future development of the Parks and Green Space Master Plan. We know that there's this really important policy document coming up, and one of the ideas we've heard floated and that we really liked was the idea of tying tree removal decisions to neighborhood-level tree canopy targets. Something that sounds exciting, and the idea of there being kind of maybe a sliding scale for the degree to which we're protecting trees based on some of these especially vulnerable neighborhoods, Wellington West, Centertown, and many of the communities in the urban area. So way forward, again, just with my remaining seconds, we urge consistent resource prioritization. Let's get that strong language in the Parks and Green Space Master Plan and in the official plan. And obviously, I think this is a theme coming up today. We've identified a need for education. Community partners like Ecology Ottawa are there to help get the word out, knock on more doors, and so happy to work with the city in terms of the types of things that we're saying to the community in order to get the broadest amount of buy-in for tree protection in our city. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Barnes. Is there questions from committee? members' questions? Just on your point about the tree canopy targets, I will have some direction associated with staff later on in the meeting related to that directly. So thanks very much for coming in. Okay, who do we have next? Daniel Buckles? Okay, Mr. Buckles.
I have a presentation. Good afternoon, councillors, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. You have before you a written submission on behalf of cafes, community associations for environmental sustainability, the Green Space Alliance, and the Federation of Citizens Associations, which covers 3 main points, each of which will be addressed separately in verbal presentations. We respect your time, so we won't be repeating points from one to the other. The staff report makes several references to participation by community associations in the tree bylaw review project, including our own combined recommendations endorsed by many neighborhood associations from different parts of the city, and many local environmental organizations and university groups as well. There's much to be happy about in both the report and the revised bylaw. And we want to be clear that we support approval of both today. However, we've been surprised by some of the staff recommendations and are deeply concerned about the timing of implementation, the narrow focus of the bylaw on site-specific considerations, not taking into account broader objectives, and lack of commitment to funding, what staff and the community have been asking for over 10 years now. With my remarks, I want to give you a sense of why people in the urban area are so angry, if you will, about what has happened to the tree canopy over the last 10 years and the future that we fear. Some councillors around the table already know this from their constituents, but others may still be wondering why the big deal about trees. To make my point, I will paint a picture of the past, the present, and the future. You could call it a Christmas carol. First, the past. This tree on Patricia Avenue in Kitchissippi is known as the party tree because the neighborhood street party takes place under this tree every year. It's a bur oak, somewhere in the neighborhood of 160 years old, and a remnant of the original ancient oak forest that lined this part of the Ottawa River. This is a view of Westboro Beach from the Metropole, taken about 8 years ago. This is the view from my office window in my home, a view not too different from what homes in many neighborhoods have enjoyed. Now the present. As the staff report notes, 5 urban neighborhoods lost and did not replace between 30 and 58% of the trees sampled. New construction accounted for between 22% and 46% of tree removals across the study neighborhoods. Emerald ash borer was not the primary cause, according to the staff report. Now the future. This photo is part of an art project by Frank Johnson, exploring what he calls the lost trees of Ottawa. The loss is already palpable in Rideau, Vanier, and Somerset wards, in Kitchissippi and Capital wards. This map, which was developed by Big Trees of Kitchissippi, is an app where residents are posting trees, stories, and memories of trees lost in Ottawa for natural and human causes. For councillors elsewhere, this bleak feature is coming. to Bay Ward, to College Ward, to all of the other wards as well. There's a little, this is also from Frank Johnson showing it, the lost tree in the left corner. The staff report and proposed bylaw changes will give forestry inspectors some good tools to work with, but phasing of the bylaw takes a big step backwards. Protection of young trees between 30 and 50 centimeters are not covered by the funding you are being asked to approve today. These teenage trees are the future of our urban forest canopy and will provide the most benefits in the face of climate change. Given this, the considerable risk of delaying the protection of these trees, we call on Council to expedite the implementation and funding needed for additional forestry inspectors and to find a way to address what is in effect open season on young trees during what is was an avoidable and unfortunate transition period. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bucks. Questions from delegation? Okay. All right, thank you so much. Appreciate it. So we have next is Mr. Paul Johannes with Green Space Alliance, followed by Heather Pearl.
Thank you, Chair Moffat. First, I'd like to straight off just say I hope and we hope and expect that you'll receive and approve the report that's been presented to you today. But I'm here to talk about a particular issue, one issue, and it's an omission. It's something that could have been, should have been, we're hoping will be in the bylaw eventually. And it's this issue of tying tree removal decisions to the attainment and maintenance of the targets for canopy cover, that there be a link between those two things. So maintaining a healthy tree canopy in all parts of the urban area is a critical climate mitigation measure and an adaptation measure. It's also a matter of public health. So to maintain the tree canopy at a certain minimum threshold, and some public health research suggests that maybe 40% is kind of that level at which public health benefits really kick in. And this at a very small scale, like sort of like a few city blocks kind of thing. Now, to attain and maintain the local tree canopy at that threshold level, you need an integrated approach. You need to deal with plantings, you need to deal with care and nurture, you need to deal with retention, you have to deal with end-of-life removal as well. It's a cycle. That's what the Urban Forest Management Plan is about. The bylaw that we're looking at today is about the retention piece mostly. It's all about the retention piece. So how are trees being retained under the bylaw? And I'd focus your attention to Part 5 of the bylaw, the one that deals with trees on private property less than 1 hectare, because that's really where the conflict between intensification and densification and tree retention is most acute. That's where the real action is happening. In Section 65 of the draft bylaw, it gives the general manager the authority to either approve with conditions, or deny an application. So all three options are on the table. This is deny an application for the destruction of a distinctive tree. Now, the general manager's discretion is constrained in a number of cases, like the first 4 cases. If the tree's damaged, ill, if the trees pose a risk to a roof or load-bearing structure, if the tree needs to be removed because of some soil remediation, if the decision's already been subject to council or committee of adjustment or other committee decision, if the facts on the ground are as stated, well, then the permit will be issued. There's no real retention opportunity there. In the other 3 cases, though, there's quite a lot of discretion for the general manager, delegated down, about whether to issue the permit or not. If a satisfactory landscaping plan exists, the permit may be issued. If there's no reasonable alternative, a permit may be issued. Or in the last case, under any other circumstance deemed appropriate by the general manager, a permit may be issued. So this is very broad discretion to exercise, and it's not about retention necessarily. It's always, retention is kind of the fallback. The first thing is there's broad discretion to issue a permit, but there's no explicit basis really stated in the bylaw for a permit to remove a healthy, mature tree to be denied beyond this type of blanket authority that's provided. It's all sort of in the blanks of each condition. It's an exercise of discretion that is very open and which can be subject to undue pressure or otherwise be accused of arbitrariness and unpredictability. And it sets up this tree-by-tree kind of war of attrition, which is really what we have now, and which has led really to the observed canopy loss. So there is a difference, and when we saw, not in the information but in the staff presentation, that there is guidance being provided regarding tree removals that might be supported or not in review, and that's whether or not the trees inside the building envelope of in terms of on the specific development application under review. But it's not in the bylaw, and not clear that it's enforceable in that way. And it may even set in place an incentive for builders to expand the building envelope to cover the entire lot so as to remove any possibility of tree retention. So we believe that an external objective test outside these site-specific considerations should be added to the bylaw, and that this test should be tying permitting decisions regarding distinctive trees to the achievement or maintenance of local canopy targets. We've made this point through consultations, and so it's not a new thing. It's not being sprung here on the process. We've talked about it before. Now, how would this work? Well, once local canopy targets are set, distinctive tree removals would be permitted where the current measurement of canopy cover exceeds the target. If you're above the target, no problem. In cases where the measured canopy equals or falls short of the threshold, the application would be denied. Now, this isn't a final thing because the urban forest evolves all the time. Intensification potential evolves all the time. So this, in fact, could set up a planning cycle where you can realize, oh, maybe in 5 years we'll be above the canopy target here. Maybe then it becomes an intensification target that's worth looking at, and so on. So as the bylaw is the city's only instrument for retaining distinctive trees, and given that the documented loss of distinctive trees is a major cause of the observed reduction in local canopy cover, it seems to us inescapable that the two must be linked. So we had kind of a draft motion to put forward with some non-specific language, but we understand at this point that it's kind of premature and that staff wouldn't support that kind of position because the work hasn't been done, hasn't been thought through. So what we would ask is that for committee to instruct staff to work with stakeholders in the coming months on ways to tie decisions regarding the removal and retention of trees under the tree bylaw to the achievement and maintenance of local canopy targets, and to report back to committee on how this could be done.
Have you shared that with us? Because I don't have a submission from you on the. Oh, okay. Never mind. We're all good. Questions for Mr. Hannes? Seeing none. Thank you. Next speaker is Heather Pearl, followed by John Dickey. Ms. Pearl is with the Federation of Citizens Associations.
This one? Okay. Hi, I'm Heather Pearl. I'm representing the Federation of Citizens Associations, and I've represented the FCA on both the Infill 1 and 2 working groups and on the Urban Tree Conservation Bylaw from its basic inception back in 2008. Our concern is that we really can't afford to delay any longer in implementing appropriate tree protections. I note in the mayor's State of the City address, he's dealt with tree planting, greening of parks, putting in a tougher tree bylaw to make it expensive for all those all too common oopsies to happen. The FCA says that we see this recognition that tree preservation and planting is a key climate change mitigation measure, so we recommend that place design with nature front and center in all cases, and expeditiously fund and implement the new Urban Tree Conservation Bylaw. And The reason that we think this is really important is because we've been here many times before. I go back to, I have data going back to 96, 97, where we had FCA participating on a stakeholder committee to develop recommendations for the Tree Protection and Conservation Policies Project. So there was a public workshop, a DELCAN report, stakeholder committee meetings. Documents were produced that were eerily familiar to ones I've seen today. And then there was silence. In 2004, City Council made a direction to staff to undertake more consultation regarding tree conservation in Ottawa. 4 years later, that resulted in 2008-2009 tree conservation bylaw, urban tree conservation bylaw development. 2009, Council approved the bylaw, provided a one-year lead-in to implementation to educate the public. The education stretched for 10 years. The necessary resources were never provided to properly implement this bylaw. Further, in May 9th, 2012, as part of the low-rise infill housing study, Council approved proposed changes to the city's submission requirements and procedures, including procedures and fees for new planting, the urban tree conservation bylaw as detailed in document 4, and direct the appropriate branches to implement these changes within 8 months of Council approval of this report. So basically, they were to provide the tree disclosure information to building permits and to the Committee of Adjustment. And again, there was silence. The infill 1 and 2 bylaws make room for tree preservation. Part of the intent is to ensure that individual buildings fit into a city block in a way that leaves a sufficient amount of open space in the middle of the block for air and sunlight penetration, preservation of permeable surfaces, and existing vegetation. I mean, really important stuff. It's there in that bylaw. In April 19th, 2016, I did a statistical analysis of a statistical summary of activity, distinctive tree permits from 2010 to 2015, and it was evident that severe cumulative losses showed that deforestation was the status quo in Ottawa. In June 20th, 2017, the Urban Forest Management Plan was passed by the Environment Committee. We were part of the stakeholder group, best consultation process ever. This was an awesome thing. Hundreds of Ottawans participated to help create this fine policy. One of the key directions was to review, revise, and fully implement a stronger urban tree conservation bylaw. We noted as part of our submission that we still needed to adopt the May 2012 process changes that would help us do that. In spring 2018, building permits received a new requirement for the tree disclosure report, but nothing went to the Committee of Adjustment. And they want it. So we've had cumulative ongoing losses to our ecosystem services. Implementing the bylaw in 2 phases. Is history going to repeat itself? We can't afford to delay further. This is such a small amount of money to actually fund this program. 8 full-time FTEs. Let's do this. In March 3rd, 2011, I wrote an article for the Kitchissippi, well, actually it was News West then, and I ended the article with, if intensification continues to be implemented as it is now, the day will come when no people want to stroll along treeless streets where the non-stop hum of air conditioners has replaced the sound of wind in the leaves. In December 2019, from many parts of the city, this day has come. More than 50% of tree cover is lost.
I know you got a couple more slides, but I just want to ask if you could just try to wrap up. You're just a bit 40 seconds over time.
Okay. Each new build, more than 50% of permeable surface loss, storm and sanitary sewer increasingly affected, streets growing potholes, river and rainstorm overland flooding is, and I haven't been pressing my buttons, so All right, sorry. Yeah, thank you. So we remember what we've lost. Pre-Confederation Healthy Bur Oak, 1.2 meters DBH, 19 meters high, only halfway through its expected lifespan. We had hired a forester to do an assessment. As a tree with origins which predate settlement, it can be safely assumed it is of pure stock and adapted to local growing conditions, something which cannot be said of most planted trees. This was a heritage tree. It came down for development. Finally, we know that tree cover is linked to health outcomes. A recent meta-analysis published in The Lancet, funded by the WHO, talks about the inverse association between surrounding greenness and all-cause mortality. We just really cannot afford to wait any longer. So please, we need those FTEs, we need the bylaw working, action, and we need these great people in forestry to get the resources they deserve.
All right, thank you very much. Questions from councillors? Seeing none, thank you very much, Ms. Pearl, for your presentation. Next is John Dickey with the Eastern Ontario Landlord Organization, followed by Jason Burgraff with Greater Ottawa Home Builders Association.
Thank you. So EOLA was here largely in support of the report. Our members do value trees. They improve the appearance of properties. They have absorbed greenhouse gases, reduced the heat island effect, et cetera. We are, again, in large measure, glad that the city is updating its tree bylaw. We did have one concern before hearing the submissions today, but let me deal with one that what occurred to me in the last 20 minutes. And that is, we would certainly oppose linking the question of the ability to remove a tree on a single site to the tree canopy across the ward. We think that would be an unfair imposition on the owner of the lot, where conditions completely extraneous to him or her, unrelated to the lot, unrelated to the development rights on the lot, would then could effectively prevent the development of that land. There are replacement conditions that can be imposed. There are to remediate the canopy, to improve the canopy. That would be the 3-to-1 replacement. So we would respectfully submit that 3-to-1 replacement should be sufficient. The main concern I had, which triggered coming down here, was the condition that some landlords find, well, and condo management companies and condo corps too, is that they may really have little or no choice but to remove a tree in order to repair a utility line. So you can have a building with a significant number of tenants and the water line breaks. So there you have 50, 100, 200 tenants in a building, and they need that water back. Without the water, they haven't got drinking water, they can't cook, they can't wash, they can't use their toilets, they don't have any sewer service. And so we need to be able to be assured that we can get in and do that repair, and we can do it quickly. I have had this discussion with Ms. Copestake, and she assures me, originally I had wanted and suggested that we should have an exemption for that situation, but Ms. Copestake assures me that the forestry crew can come out lickety-split, evenings, weekends, in order to address the situation. So I appreciate that. That's a good thing for the residents of the city. But the sort of concern around the situation is that in the one section of the bylaw, section 50, I think it is, there's a list of why trees can be removed. And then we are subject to and that includes this repair of utility lines, or for that matter, construction. And then in the separate section that relates to the situation I've just described, section 66, there is no such reference. There is a reference, there are two kind of catch-all clauses. There is no reasonable alternative to the injury or destruction, or other circumstances deemed appropriate by the general manager. So frankly, reading that with a legal eye, it seems strange that where something is sensible to be done, is reasonable to be done, it is not listed, and yet somewhere else it is listed. You come at that from a legal interpretation point of view, and you would think that the situation I've described is not in the section 66. Again, I think I've been given some assurance that that will be treated as a situation where there's no reasonable alternative, but I did want to raise that for the committee and request any assistance you can provide our members in knowing that they can look after their tenants and that condo corporations can look after their residents. That's essentially all I have to say. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Dickey. Questions for Mr. Dickey? Seeing none? Thank you. And our final delegation of this afternoon is Mr. Jason Berghoff from the Greater Ottawa Home Builders Association.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Of efforts to modernize the bylaw and enhance the urban tree canopy. We support most of the proposals, including the 3-to-1 replacement ratio and considering trees earlier in the planning process. As you will see in our submission, there are a few issues that we've highlighted that require continued dialogue between city staff and industry to resolve. However, we believe that the majority of these are process and implementation issues that can be worked on moving forward. As an example, it was the cap on the 5 trees. That was something that came out of discussions just last week. Throughout the consultation process, home builders have endorsed the principle of maintaining and enhancing the urban forest, but where retention is incompatible with intensification, then a proactive agenda of replacement and renewal is needed. Home builders support robust management of the urban tree canopy to ensure that the tree bylaw is effective. This must include assurance that the urban canopy feature a variety of ages and species. This monitoring function and reporting to the public on results is essential to inform decision-making moving forward. The development of multi-housing units in an existing neighborhood supports the city's intensification goals and in fact are critical to their achievement. Impediments to creating more infill homes will have a significant impact on the development of a variety of housing types and affordability across the city, 2 more goals of the official plan critical to maintaining and enhancing the livability of Ottawa. It's essential for the city to communicate strongly that intensification and protection of the urban tree canopy are not mutually exclusive goals, but in fact can be pursued in tandem. GOBA and its members remain committed partners to achieving these goals. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for your involvement with staff on this policy development. Any questions from members of council? No, seeing none. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks.
Thanks. Oh, did you have a question? Oh, sorry. Questions for staff? Okay, Councillor Kavanaugh. We're going to go right to that.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy that we're moving forward on this. One of the first things I saw when I became a councillor was trees being taken down on infill properties and having that horrible, helpless feeling of not knowing what to do because it had already happened, and it was clear that something needed to be done like 10 steps back. And what this bylaw is doing is providing that opportunity to go those 10 steps back on future developments. We really, really need this. Queensway Terrace North, for example, was very hard hit in terms of promises made, because that was the other thing, is that developers could say they were saving a tree, but there was no teeth to it because their plans did not match what could be done. And having the intervention of a forester working with planning is absolutely essential. I am concerned about the, in terms of the the steps that we're going to do and why we can't do the 30 centimeters right away. I think there is concern there. It's already been expressed. How much more would it cost to implement that right away in terms of FTEs?
Through you, Chair. So the calculations that we've done so far are for the full 8, and it's about just under $1 million, so like the upper $800,000-900,000. But of course, we've figured out 3 of those, and we still have, through this, between now and phase 2, we'd like to look at other cost recovery options. So once we decrease the diameter, we'll have more application fees coming in, so we'd like to look at that. So we can get back to you with a number on that, but in terms of the full 8, it was just under $1 million.
There was comments that the fines are not really a problem, like somebody could just look at it as the cost of doing business if they felt that they just wanted that tree out of the way, and it wouldn't be that expensive. Would raising the fees help if we did do that in terms of hiring more staff, because we could use that money towards more foresters?
Well, I think you're referring to the fines.
Yeah, the fines.
So the money from the fines, so we go through court for those fines, and the money comes back into the general city coffers for that and doesn't come directly back to forestry for cost recovery in that way.
Yeah, well, we can, but if we know that's on the books, we know that that's where it's coming from, and that's where it should be used. I have to ask this question, even though it's something that's already happened, because I've had a lot of trees taken down in my ward.
I just wanted, Mr. Willis wanted to jump in on that, so just let.
Okay.
Yeah.
Chair, I just want to offer council or committee some advice on this. We can never rely on fines as a source to pay for programs anywhere within the city. Those are not guaranteed, no guarantees the courts would do it. We typically apply the application fees, user fees, in order to do that cost recovery. And any fines that are received by the city go into general revenues of the city. It's a general line item, and that's true in every type of fine we're dealing with.
Okay, thank you, because that's something that I will get asked, so I need to know that. I have to ask this question because of the massive tree loss that I have in Bay Ward right now, and it's related to Stage 2 LRT. How would these bylaws apply to such a project in the future? Would it apply at all?
Well, for infrastructure projects, one of the things that we've been looking at through this project that we've been doing is that whole bit of considering trees as early in the process as possible. So we've been working with our infrastructure colleagues to ensure that forestry staff is included right at the very beginning, almost when the project charter is being made for the new whatever infrastructure project it is, so that forestry staff are included right then, so that they're involved in the design of the project. So it's not like they're sometimes at this point we've been brought, and I'm not referring to LRT specifically, but brought in sort of once the design's been done, and we're going to bring that early so that we can have impact on the tree aspect of things. So that gives us an opportunity to say, you know, if you move this slightly like this, we could, you know, possibly retain these 5 more trees or something like that, you know? So that's what we've been working on through this. And as we move into our processes in the winter, that's going to be a really key focus of our efforts, is working with our infrastructure staff. Also, we will be and this is one of the things we're going to be working with them on, is requiring the tree conservation report that we require for site plans and plans of subdivision to be submitted for those infrastructure projects as well. And so we're going to be working with, like I said, infrastructure staff on how that happens. And in a lot of those projects, it's done already. It's just a matter of making it more widespread.
So, I mean, it's not quite finished, but Stage 2 LRT is pretty well, that's set because it was already set before. But what about Stage 3? Would you be able to save more trees in a project like that?
So, Chair, I'll take this question. In these instances, there are separate project-specific environmental assessment processes that address all of this. The best practices that we're establishing through this bylaw will get translated into that, but the environmental assessment is ultimately the final document that dictates that, and both the impact avoidance and the mitigation strategies that come through those processes are what govern them. So the point you're making, the councillor's making, Chair, is that we need to get that information on the best practices over to the EA processes, which is part of what we intend to do.
Okay, so that's still possible. That's good to know. My other question is and I hope the general manager will forgive me for asking this, is the power of the general manager, because there's lots of times he's mentioned throughout the document of having exemptions, and I just wanted to know what that looks like, because I know that that question will come up to me.
So, Chair, under the existing bylaw and the new bylaw, both myself and Mr. Wiley have different, the general manager, which refers to both of us under different circumstances, are our positions, not us personally. And the staff, when an application comes through, in my case, it's further delegated to Mr. Herwire, and I believe Mr. Wiley does the same thing, it's delegated to another staff person. They don't make those decisions without recommendation of professional forestry staff, and they do all full-blown analysis, and the permits are signed on the basis of staff evaluation. What Ms. Copestake has shown you, which doesn't exist today, but will exist in the future, is some general guidelines out there, a bit more transparent to the public about, and the development community, about what we will accept and will not accept. And that's a lot of what the communications in the next little while will do. And we think if there was a clearer understanding of what we're willing to entertain or not, it'll change the nature of the applications considerably. And I want to actually just correct something or clarify something that was sort of perhaps a misinterpretation in one of the comments. The diagram Ms. Copestake showed was not the building envelope, and you could just enlarge the building envelope and swallow more trees. It's the zoning envelope of where your buildable area is that's applied for in this situation. So that is fixed. That is, council sets and approves those zoning bylaws. There's no discretion in that.
Okay, thank you very much. Trees are a very emotional issue, as I've seen. People have been having memorials for trees along that the Byron route, and we just saw the cherry trees just went down today. I don't even want to go home. It's going to be very sad. So I thank you for all your work, because you're looking at the future, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Egley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so first off, thank you very much. We've had many, many discussions about this proposed bylaw, both because of the impact of the tornado and also the high level of infill development in my area, and the trees that come down that should not necessarily come down. But I have a couple questions about the proposed motion, because that's new. So you're proposing, in effect, with this motion, or Councillor Cloutier is proposing, in effect, with this motion, a maximum for infill and a maximum for, I guess, privately held trees, we'll call them. Can you run me through, let's assume you had two applications that came forward, one for an infill development, one for Mr. Herwire puts an application in because the trees are dying in his backyard, or they're interfering with his foundation, or whatever. In both cases, though, the request exceeds 5 trees. So explain to me what happens in both of those scenarios once that application arrives.
This is sort of a difficult question, but I mean, I guess, in those cases, I mean, it's going to be very similar. I mean, if it's a situation where we're talking about foundation damage, then that sort of would have to be confirmed. And so that kind of an application for a private landowner with 5 trees and foundation damage would have, a fair amount of staff time to go through the process. Those kind of applications for that many trees for private landowners are extremely rare. Most of the applications that we're receiving where there are, and this happens in your ward, where there are more than one tree or 2 trees are for development scenarios.
Right.
So it's not something that we're normally dealing with. So in the development scenario, basically the way that would work is that if it's, say, a building permit, then the building permit gets submitted. There's a requirement to submit tree information with that building permit. It gets circulated to staff. Now, assuming this all gets approved, we'll have an infill forester in planning department that will receive that. We'll also provide it to the forestry inspectors, and they'll work together on looking at what's proposed and looking at what changes they might like to see to that in terms of protecting more trees, and how to protect any other trees that they aren't applying to remove. And that's kind of that increased staff time and that's required. It's also a very quick turnaround for these infill files. In a building permit situation, I think it's about 9 days or something like that. So, so we've got several departments working on looking at these applications at once. So that's why we have a higher fee for that $500 fee for the infill application. So just to be clear, right now it's for the private, like for Don, if he's not developing his property, it's $150 up to a max of $750. And what was proposed initially was for developers, it was a $500 per tree. And the motion brings forward the idea of putting that same max 5 trees onto the developers as well.
So, no, and I get that, in the privately held scenario, there's not a requirement to replant, correct?
The requirement would be 1-to-1.
1-to-1, sorry,
Yeah.
yes, 1-to-1. And in the development, it's a 3-to-1 ratio, correct? So how do we decide on 5 as being the appropriate maximum? Because they're being done for different purposes, right? Again, in Mr. Herwire's circumstance, he's not doing it to knock down a house and rebuild. And so how do we decide that 5 was the right number? I think, for example, a file you were involved in before the tornado, there was a request to take down a whole lot more than 5 trees on a particular lot in order to put up 3 homes. So how do we know that 5 is the right number? I get it's consistent. There's seconds, but is it consistency with a rationale? Is it consistency for consistency's sake? I guess is what I'm getting at. How do we get to that 5?
So the 5 was developed for the average homeowner situation, and it was developed based on what we see as a reasonable charge for the average homeowner that may be removing a tree for some problem, you know? And that's how we developed that, and that's why we fell at 5. So that's how the 5 was developed. The motion to bring forward the max for a development scenario, that was just putting it in line with that one that we developed before.
Right, which I'm saying is consistency for consistency's sake. But I guess what I'm getting at is, how do we justify 5 as a reasonable number in a development scenario? Do we have numbers on how many trees come down on average in an infill, for example?
In Martha's presentation, she spoke to cost recovery, as when it comes to permitting, you have to use it with the lens of cost recovery.
I fully understand that, Chair. Understand that. But
Okay, well, that's the answer.
Well, I don't know that that's the answer, because I don't know if on average they're taking 5 trees down or if they're taking 15 trees down. So that's what I'm trying to get.
And I think what staff's saying is that
they don't know.
The amount of work that goes into whether you want to take 5 trees down or 15 trees down is the exact same cost. So when you're making a permit fee on a cost recovery, if all of a sudden you charge whatever it is, $500 times 15, now all of a sudden you're making a profit off of your permit fees, which is not permitted under the Municipal Act.
I'm fully aware it's not permitted. I'm just trying to, what I've heard so far, and staff's being as transparent as they can be in answering these questions, is that the 5 trees is based on a privately held home. I don't see a metric that transfers to a development. So I'm asking if we have any sense of how many trees are requested to come down in your average infill application.
So we don't have that number, but you know, anecdotally we can say that it's much less, especially when we're dealing with distinctive trees at 50 centimeters. So in the average situation, it's much less. It's often, I would say, 1 or 2, maybe 3, that kind of thing. But like the chair says, it is a cost recovery consideration.
Yep. No, I understand
and
that.
so it is that thing where are we looking at kind of yeah, really a revenue off of
Sure.
asking for
No,
more
and I
more.
get that. And just one final question. So are you comfortable with the 5, keeping in mind the comment that you made earlier? You have a very quick turnaround on the development applications. You have to put more staff on it more quickly. So are you keeping all that in mind, which suggests that different resources or the same resources are being utilized more quickly? Are you satisfied that the 5 will provide you that cost recovery that you require?
Yes, Chair. We felt, in terms of the level of effort required, that would be adequate. We'll obviously be monitoring that, but in terms of today, that's our best valuation in terms of the level of effort.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McKinney.
Thank you, Chair. I want to pick up on what Mr. Bevan from the Trees and Green Space Committee was pointing out about the specific rules for intensification versus the infill development. So could you explain what the flexibility on tree removals for developments, creating more units, what that means? And I do want to, I mean, I agree with the assessment that was made by the speaker that, you know, pretty much everything we're doing, hopefully, and it's what we're encouraging, is intensification. So anytime we're, you know, removing, you know, we're looking at our new R4 zone. So, you know, in the urban core, especially around transit, where we want people to live, we are intensifying even on small lots, and we're looking at even smaller lots. So, how does that? Could you just, yeah, give me some. What your thoughts were around that flexibility, because I'm not sure that I agree with making the rules less stringent when we're adding units, even though I want to add units, but I want the trees too.
Right? I feel the same way.
We like people, but we like them to breathe. It's a funny thing.
No, I mean, I feel the same way as you, and I mean, that's sort of the biggest challenge with this effort and this initiative that we're talking about today, is that thing where we have these 2 important goals at the city, and one is to maintain and increase our urban canopy to keep, you know, maintain our resiliency into the future, and the other is to intensify for a lot of the other same reasons, you know, and so, I mean, when we floated that idea as a possible way that we would, you know, implement some of these ideas, and we haven't completely determined exactly how that's going to work. Through the winter, we're going to be going through developing all of our processes and our decision-making processes, and so you know, it is still to be determined. There's been a discussion about the tying decision-making to the canopy cover targets, and that is something that staff intend to do over time once those canopy cover targets are set. And now that we have our canopy cover analysis done at a neighborhood level, we're going to be able to be looking at that moving forward when we set the targets, and so that's to come next year. And so that's one of the ways that we will work to balance those 2, you know, somewhat competing objectives of the city, is by looking at that directly. The other thing is that I feel, you know, so positive about the direction that we're going in terms of those sort of clear rules that we put up there, and like we've said, it's a case-by-case basis, but you know, the message is that Ottawa's getting tough on trees, is what I've been saying, you know, and we do expect to be implementing this in a different way than we were implementing it before, and so there are going to have to be some tough decisions that are made, and we're going to have to figure out how that plays out with these 2 competing values.
No, I appreciate that, and again, you know, even when we put in cycling infrastructure, we take down trees. Like, I get somebody coming to me at least once a week, and it's sometimes staff, sometimes not, with a really good reason to cut down a tree in the downtown, and it's always a really good reason. And I argue back very hard, and I fight against it, and sometimes I win. But it's, you know, when we consider everything else that we're doing, trees are often, you know, again, they get that last priority. And I just want to make sure that this language is not setting up trees as that last priority, because we do want intensification, we do need more units. It's the whole, I mean, it's part of housing and affordability, I get that. But it can happen in a lot of places, but, you know, so I guess what I'm hearing from you is eventually, soon, I hope we'll have canopy targets, and they will help us to establish where we are inflexible. Is that kind of sum it up?
And that will be one of the ways. Another thing is that we, with sort of this education piece, this continued education on the value of trees, and it, you know, we've been laughing because it keeps morphing over my career how we've educated and what values we think people are going to grab onto, you know. But you know, trees can be a great benefit to infrastructure projects, to development projects, and we want to keep pushing that forward so that we can see how, especially in these like dense and, you know, I live right downtown, you know, often harsh environments, how we can incorporate trees into these developments in unique ways. So I think that education piece is really important too, and you know, look to see a change over time. I think we'll probably have growing pains in the first year in terms of how we're doing this, you know, but hopefully with, like I said, with those clear rules, we're going to see a change over time where if that's kind of the baseline, then come back to us with different kinds of plans eventually.
So maybe I could, if I could put to you a specific example, and one that's, that has been quite troublesome, and just tell me if what we're looking at today will make a difference going forward. So we are near LeBreton Flats, near where the new library is going in. We are changing that roadway, Albert and Slater. We're, you know, taking out Slater. We're making Albert and Slater two ways. The library is going in just below the escarpment. And there's right now a multi-use pathway, and there are many wonderful, there are about 10, 15-year-old trees running along the multi-use pathway. I think you probably know where I'm going. So, because I'm going to fight for those trees forever. I will eventually chain myself to them if need be. So you've got all that, those wonderful trees that have been there 10, 15 years. They're just giving us some nice canopy, because new trees give us nothing for 15 years, right? Like nothing. You make it 3 to 1, you make it 100 to 1. Actually, I did have the federal government once give me 100 to 1 trees for taking down 4. So those trees are slated to come down. Our functional design had them all coming down, and we said yes to that. I said no. But would this bylaw protect those 30 trees that are 10 to 15 years old? Would we find a way, when we say yes to this today and at council, to protect those trees? Because if we don't, we have not gone nearly far enough.
I guess one part of this, what Tracy just mentioned to me, is that aspect of getting in early on the functional design. And obviously this is it's a difficult one. It's an area that's been in such massive flux over the last 10, 15 years, and those trees got put in when they got put in. I haven't been a part of the project, so I'm not totally certain.
Not blaming
on all the
anyone here.
What's that?
So I'm not blaming anyone here.
Yeah.
I know who to blame.
But that part of getting in earlier on the design is where we would have the best impact in a situation like that.
Okay, I'll leave it there for now. I've got a few
Councillor, I would
years.
just like to add, our general manager here has been avidly communicating to our partners in infrastructure, to our partners in building code services. So big kudos to Mr. Willis, and that communication is happening internally. So this should be resonating with people. This shouldn't be new.
Well, that was only a few months ago, so lots of work left to educate our own staff. I'll leave it at that. Phase 2, the 50 to 30 centimeter, I get that it'll take a few extra months to come up with the funding that we need, but what's stopping us from putting that in place today and just saying, like, that's the rule, don't cut them down?
So Chair, the simple answer is it is the staffing and financial resources, plus we need lead time to do the education, even advise people of this. We can't just throw a new system of fairly significant change and flip the switch overnight. We care deeply about getting these new rules in place. Even if we had the ability to jump right to the phase 2 right away, we would still need a lead up time. So the difference in time we're talking about is a few months. And we do intend to bring forward these matters in the next year's budget to address the remaining resources gaps.
And I just want to, thank you for that. I just want to just ask about the example that Mr. Dickey had brought up about the utility repairs and Schedule 66 and just the difference in wording. Can you just respond to that in terms of what the intent would be if there was an emergency repair?
So the concern was that if there was need to, restore water service or some such thing, and there happened to be a tree in the way of the place where the work had to be done on that water service, how do we have sort of a guarantee that a permit would be issued to remove that tree? And we're not here to be unreasonable about anything, and there are in that section 66 that indicates why a tree permit may be issued. It's clear that well, number one, it says to the discretion of the general manager, but it's also clear that if there's no reasonable alternative to the destruction or injury of the tree, a tree permit may be issued. So it's clear in a situation like that that a tree permit would be issued for that. And I will also add that one could argue that if a tree is posing a threat to public health and safety, it's exempt from the bylaw, and there isn't a requirement to get a permit. So this would, when we have had these windstorms, when the tornado came through, the trees that were damaged and hazardous or a threat in some way, there was no requirement for people to wait in some sort of a queue for a permit for removal. And I would say that if you could make an argument that not having water service because of a tree could be a threat to public health and safety, and so we'd take that as it comes.
Thank you very much. Councillor Menard.
Thanks very much, Chair. So thank you for the report and all the work you've put in and the work with stakeholders. This is making a lot of positive steps forward. There's fantastic things in here. There's more to be desired on certain aspects, and I'm confident that when you come back to report to us, we're going to see some more action that you've talked about, and also other stakeholders and incorporating their feedback into that next report. And so with that, I just have the direction that we had talked about previously associated with that, the tree canopy targets. And so it's that the Standing Committee on Environmental Protection, Water and Waste Management directs staff to determine, in consultation with community stakeholders, reporting back to committee in the Phase 2 report on how best to consider canopy cover targets at the neighborhood level as part of the tree permitting process under the new tree protection bylaw once the targets have been identified and included in the city's new official plan. So I'll leave that with you and expect some report back, I guess, as part of the 2020 report back.
Yeah, just to make sure committee members okay with that direction. Okay, thanks.
And then just to comment on a few other pieces, the motion that's in front of us now, the Cloutier motion, I have some questions around that. You looked at a number of cities, I think, in Ontario. Was it only Ontario or across Canada on there?
We looked at some cities outside of Ontario, but focused in on the Ontario cities.
And out of all the cities you looked at, did any of them, did the majority of them have no maximum in terms of distinctive tree permit removal fees? What was the numbers that you saw?
Yeah, the only one that we came across that had a maximum was London, Ontario, and they have a much lower permitting fee schedule than we're going with. But the others that we based ours on, so Toronto, Oakville, there was no maximum for those development scenarios.
Okay, that's good to know. The majority of them that you looked at, there was no maximum. Why do we have a difference between, and Councillor Argo was kind of getting at this, but why do we have a difference between the private homeowner's cost and the infill development cost for you folks? What is the difference there in terms of tree removal for distinctive trees?
The first thing is the level of detail that, for an infill development application, the level of detail that we have to go into in terms of what is proposed to happen on the site. So we have all of the plans that are submitted, and we have to look at all of those plans and review all those plans and understand the implications of all of those plans, as well as the tree aspects. And then, of course, you know, we also have a big role to play in convincing to retain trees, and that, you know, that's time and that's effort as well. In the scenario where it's the average homeowner removing a distinctive tree for some reason, whatever it may be, the report that's required to be submitted is an arborist report, and it often has, it doesn't have to have as much information because the complexities of the proposal are so much smaller, you know? Okay. And so, so basically those are implemented by our forestry inspectors. They receive the arborist report, which is usually, you know, a page, less than a page, just indicating why the tree is proposed for removal. And that's a visit to the site, and there you go. So it's basically that staff time, cost recovery for that staff time.
Okay, so there's more staff time required to review the infill applications than there is, say, a private homeowner that may want to put in a pool or something else like that. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of the sort of permitting under the Municipal Act piece of it, for a long time we've been undercharging for removals of trees. Right? Was it $100, I guess, for a distinctive tree for removal? So we're way behind the cart, I guess, on this one. We've been really undercharging. We've been seeing the removal in our within the Greenbelt area in urban core of up to upwards of 50% or 58% of our canopy. There was something you wrote in the staff report, again, related to the motion that's on the table, and it says that related to London, Toronto, Oakville, and Kingston, the increase in the application fees is also can act as a disincentive for removing trees. So in your view, if we do set a cap limit of those 5 trees in total, would that not be kind of in opposition of the disincentive we're trying to create, in some cases, for tree removal?
It absolutely could be. And like I said earlier, we are not often seeing application for that many trees. Right. So in that case, it wouldn't, you know, it wouldn't, but yes.
Okay.
Chair, if I may, on the fees, keep in mind that at budget time, we can recommend an increase to those fees. So in the 2021 budget submissions, if staff find that the fees and the capping isn't working for us, we can recommend a change to that.
That's great. I'm glad to see that, and we may need that. I guess in this instance, I'm just speaking to the cap total as the disincentive, and it's clear that it'll act in the opposite way that we're trying to achieve in this sense. So I think I'd encourage my colleagues to vote against that motion for that very reason. It wasn't in the original staff report. I think this would be doing something that we shouldn't do, and that the majority of cities in Ontario, in fact, don't do now. Only one does it that we looked at. So I'd recommend voting against it. Chair, is there anyone else on the speakers list to this item? Or? Okay, so it's just that. You know, I think it's important the Environment Committee does vote on this item. I do think that it should be voted on here. We're the ones considering, and we've had the information presented to us. So I think calling the question on that motion is important at this point, to call the question on the Cloutier motion.
So I'm actually going to suggest that we refer it. I spoke to Mr. Willis, and he said that clearly there's not enough information that we have at committee. Given the absence of information to decide on that, there seems to be a discomfort level with the motion at this point. I would suggest that we refer it to council with non-decision and have staff provide us more information between now and then.
Okay, I think I put the question to call out there. So what happens at that point? Is there a process after a question's been called?
Mr. Chair, appreciating I haven't been here all afternoon. If a motion is brought forward to refer this motion to council without a recommendation, it would be before council at its January meeting with a recommendation that council consider it. So moved and seconded, it could be put on the floor for approval at that time, and between now and January 29th, there would be an opportunity to get additional information from staff if needed.
Okay. So yeah, in this scenario, I've said I'd like to call the question. Then we've said we want a motion to refer after that point of time. So if someone has to put a motion on the floor to refer it, and then we have to vote on that first, or are you saying that we would call the question, vote on the actual motion first, and then come back to her? Well, I guess we wouldn't refer at that point.
Mr. Chair, my apologies for missing that. Has the question been put, Mr. Chair?
Councillor Menard had just suggested the question be put. It's just, I didn't confirm that it was. You just suggested, I would just suggest that we just pull the motion then. It's not my motion. It was a motion brought forward from staff. Just pull the motion. We'll talk more with staff. And then if there's a desperate desire to revisit, we can do so at council.
Mr. Chair, if I might.
Go ahead.
You know, the fact is that the Municipal Act does talk about cost recovery, and the 5 trees are staff's estimate with respect to a level that recovers the cost of processing tree applications. $150.
Point of order? On?
Process.
Well, I just suggested that it be withdrawn. He's the mover, so
I was
he's
just
speaking
going to
his
get to
motion.
that. And on the basis of the fact that we appear to require more information with respect to the costs and the cost recovery aspect as mandated by the Municipal Act, on that basis and on the advice of staff, I would move to withdraw the motion.
I accept that. I don't want today to be about some random motion about some cap that isn't going to be hardly impactful in any way, shape, or form. So let's, the report in front of us is a positive step in the right direction. Let's not get bogged down with a minor technical motion. Other questions from Councillor Menard? No, the motion was withdrawn.
Okay, thanks very much. So I presume the full report will go forward. So thank you. I'm just very happy to support this report today. Thanks for all your work.
All right, thank you. So, no further questions? Oh, Councillor Rockington.
Thank you. No questions. Just a brief comment. I don't want my lack of discourse to signal that I'm not interested. I think this is a very good report, and certainly staff came and briefed me, and we had a good chat, I believe, last week. I think there's, the macro level side that can be argued, the importance of course, urban canopy and all the environmental benefits, which I won't repeat. We've had a good discussion at this committee today and prior today about the urban canopy, but also the micro level benefits in urban neighborhoods in particular, and the value of trees. We've seen some of the delegations. And I was quite shocked the last term of council when we would see the impact on some communities. I believe it was in Westboro, Councillor Leeper's ward, about infill development and the impact that those developments were having on trees, which may survive the actual construction, but because of the impact on the roots or just the whole shock to the tree or trees, that they eventually don't make it, and the need for much stronger teeth, much stronger bylaw. Certainly when I go door to door campaigning and you meet thousands of people at once, there were horror stories, especially in 2014, about trees, prominent trees that have been lost in the community. And I get to benefit because I'm starting to get the infill that we've seen in other wards, and so I'm going to have the protection that other wards have not benefited from. And so I'm very grateful, maybe too late for some, but that we're going forward with much stronger protection bylaw, which I firmly support. May not be perfect in everyone's eyes, but it's a lot stronger here, and it signals from the city to our residents and developers and others of where we stand on this. So with that, I am very supportive of what's before us. Thank you.
Great, thank you for those remarks, Councillor Rockington. So the report in front of us is that the Standing Committee on Environment Protection, Water and Waste Management recommend the Council, 1, approve the proposed tree protection bylaw in the form attached as documents 1 and 2 and as described in this report. 2, approve the proposed application fees attached in document 2 as Schedule D of the proposed tree protection bylaw and summarized in document 5, fee schedule. 3, approve the phased approach to the implementation of the tree bylaw review as described in this report. 4, direct staff to report back with phase 2 amendments to the tree protection bylaw as described in this report in Q3 of 2020. 5, approve the establishment of 2 new permanent full-time forestry inspector positions in Public Works and Environmental Services in 2020 for the implementation of phase 1 of the tree protection bylaw, the cost of which will be offset by increased revenues from the new fees for a net zero impact on the 2020 budget. And 6, delegate the authority to the General Manager, Planning, Infrastructure, and Economic Development, and the City Solicitor to finalize and make necessary adjustments to the proposed tree protection bylaw to give effect to the intent of Council. On that report? Carried. Thank you. So that's it for the regular agenda items. In-camera items, there are none. Notices of motion. I know Councilor Menard has one for our January 29th committee meeting.
Do you want me to read it or not?
Sorry, that's Council. It's for our February Environment Committee meeting. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, Chair. I'm just going to read the
Just summarize it and
Yeah.
read the resolution.
Yeah, it just has to do with our investment around fossil fuels. And so therefore be it resolved, the Standing Committee on Environment recommend to FEDCO that City of Ottawa commit to no new purchases of stocks or mutual funds with coal, oil, and gas companies, specifically excluding any new investment in the 200 largest publicly traded fossil fuel companies, sell off of all fossil fuel holdings from these companies over the next 5 years, which is a very low amount in Ottawa, and reinvest the proceeds into clean energy and sustainable companies. Thanks.
Thank you. So just, you might have noticed, in the notice of motion, it speaks to recommending that Environment Committee recommend to FEDCO. It's something that really fits under the purview of this committee in terms of its genesis as to what the nature of the motion is, but it's something we don't have the authority to do, so we have to recommend to FEDCO to do that before it goes to Council. Any other notices of motion? Seeing none. Inquiries? None. Other business? None. Adjournment? So moved and carried. Our next meeting will be Tuesday, February 18th, 2020. Merry Christmas to everyone. Unless you happen to be on the Transit Commission, then good luck tomorrow.